I studied piano in Frankfurt on the Main at the Raff Conservatoire of Music under Max Schwartz, a former pupil of Hans von Bülow and of Liszt, and having excited some attention in Frankfurt at the Conservatoire concerts by a performance of 3 etudes of Liszt, Fiffolet, Paysage, and Mazeppa, the directors of the Raff Conservatoire were desirous that I should play these works to the master himself. With the concurrence of Hans von Bülow, who was the honorary president of the Raff Conservatoire, I set out for Weimar armed with a letter of introduction to Liszt. It was a serene Sunday morning in the early days of June 1885. I was accompanied by Arthur Freetime, one of the best pupils of Liszt, who acted as his secretary. The meeting took place in the music room of Liszt's house, which was a villa and called the Hofgärtnerei, in the grounds of the Grand Ducal Palace. I remember it as a pleasant room with tall windows looking on to the park, which was interspersed by an occasional oak tree and some sycamore bushes. It breathed the atmosphere of infinite peace and culture. Something of the spirit of Goethe and Schiller hovered over the house. It was indeed a haven of rest and a source of inspiration for the poet and musician. In the room were 2 pianos, a Bechstein Grand and an Ebach upright. There were no portraits on the walls, but on the writing desk were 2 small photographs, one of Hans von Bülow and the other of Vera Mukhanov, a lifelong friend of Liszt. Off the study on the right-hand side of the room, as I saw later, was Liszt's bedroom. Over the bedstead hung a large cross and a picture of his name saint, St. Francis of Assisi. Suddenly the door of this bedroom opened, and there stood before me the man who as a child had received the kiss of consecration from the mighty Beethoven himself, who had been during their lifetime the friend of Chopin, of Paganini, the pioneer for Hector Berlioz and Richard Wagner, the inventor of a new form in orchestral music, namely the symphonic poem, the teacher, the preceptor of Karl Tausig and Hans von Bülow, and all the great pianists from the 40s of the last century down to that day in 1886. Here was the astounding personality who had exercised such an incredible influence in music, and not only in France and Germany, but in Russia. It would have been a moving experience to meet such a man today. To the boy I was then, it was simply overwhelming. He read the letter of introduction, turned to me with his commanding yet kindly eye, and said, "Schwartz writes that you play, among other things, the fugue from Opus 106. Here he hummed the theme, which sounded from his lips like the growl of a lion, and said, giving me a friendly slap on the shoulder, "Tomorrow you play the fugue from Opus 106. And the interview was at an end. I rushed from that room in an indescribable state of mind. Freetime, My good friend followed more leisurely, murmuring, "Isn't he wonderful?" Ah, glorious youth! As we wandered down the alley on that unforgettable Sunday morning, all the birds on the trees, the innumerable bullfinches, the magpies, the blackbirds, the robin redbreasts, seemed to warble more joyously, more melodiously than usual. I took it for granted that they were singing St. Francis' Sermon to the Birds, one of the finest of Liszt's inspirations. It was because of my playing of some of Liszt's works that Schwartz had given me his recommendation. So I naturally assumed that he would ask me to play something of his own. I had been working on his Étude Transcendentale, which was pretty stiff going for a student. This is the one I hoped he would ask me to play. It is called Feu Follet, or Will of the Wisp. Any of you who remember the fireflies on summer evenings in the forests of the Tyrol will recognize the source of Liszt's inspiration. We who were studying with Liszt met together every second day at the Hofgärtnerei. Sometimes there were only a few of us, and he could be very strict, even severe in his remarks. The mere mechanical attainments of pianoforte technique meant very little to him. Speed, pure and simple, of which so much is made by many pianists of the present day, he held in contempt. I remember a pianist who was performing Chopin's Polonaise in A-flat and playing it with great gusto. When he came to the celebrated octave passage in the left hand, Liszt interrupted him by saying, "I don't want to listen to how fast you can play octaves. What I wish to hear is the canter of the horses of the Polish cavalry before they gather force and destroy the enemy." These few words are characteristic of Liszt. The poetical vision always arose before his mental eye, whether it was a Beethoven sonata, a Chopin nocturne, or a work of his own. It was not merely interpreting a work, but real reproduction. Let us take an example, the G-sharp minor variation from Schumann's Etude Symphonique. No pianist, and I have heard them all, ever got that sighing, wailing, murmuring sound of the accompaniment in the left, and certainly no pianist played the noble melody in the right hand with such indescribable pathos as Liszt did. As a composer, Liszt still remains a controversial figure. He has enthusiastic advocates and equally energetic detractors. Ravel, Debussy, Scriabin, Stravinsky, Bartók, and Hindemith, every one of these men has received justice and appreciation in our day. Not so Liszt. I think I can give an explanation. Liszt cannot be classified. Moreover, Liszt's influence is felt less through his own compositions than through some of those of his successors, who followed and developed the ideas originated by Liszt in the symphonic poems which he began to compose in 1847. A polyphonic composer such as Richard Strauss, for example, with his highly complex orchestral technique, makes more of the metamorphosis of theme that Liszt exploits in his Faust Symphony than its originator could do. Richard Strauss, in his tone poem Die Eulenspiegel, employs the same idea. Works like the Faust Symphony, the Sonata, the two pianoforte concertos, the 12th Etude Transcendentale will always be played. At one of the lessons in Weimar, a Hungarian pianist played the concerto in A major with my good friend Freetime playing the orchestral accompaniment on a second piano from memory. The orchestral part is rather complicated. Liszt said to Freetime, "What? You play the orchestral part from memory?" And Freetime answered, "Yes, and I love every note of it." I shall never forget the solemn look on Liszt's face as he raised his hand and with eyes uplifted, he said quietly, I can wait. Ich kann warten. I played all the principal pieces of my repertoire in these lessons in Weimar and followed Liszt to Rome and again to London in April 1886. The last concerts he ever attended were a concert given by Stavenhagen and a recital given by myself in St. James's Hall in London. Liszt never charged a fee from any of his pupils, and we all looked upon him with a feeling akin to adoration. Felix Weingartner, the only conductor who understood the genius of Liszt the composer and who interpreted, as no one else did, gigantic works like the Faust and Dante symphonies, works strangely neglected by British composers, once said to me, Liszt was the decentest of them all. The word decent in German seems a strange word to apply to this extraordinary personality, but the more I think of it, the more I realize it is the right epithet for Liszt. Indeed, I go further than that. Liszt was the good Samaritan of his day and generation. Let us today do honor to Franz Liszt, that wonderful personality, that fiery spirit, and truly great man. Let me assure my hearers that I'm profoundly grateful to Providence to have been one of his last pupils. To those of us who knew him, he remains, after nearly 60 years, something much more vital than a memory. And if we were ever tempted to forget, it is easy to recall his in the music he played so incomparably.